Welcome to Horror Night Stories. If you enjoy dark tales and eerie mysteries, you're in the right place. I'm just starting this channel, so your support means a lot. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and leave a comment after the video to tell me what you think or what I should improve. Now, turn off the lights and let's begin tonight's horror story. Halloween night 1974, Deer Park, Texas. A quiet suburb just outside Houston. Tree-lined streets, tidy lawns, and the faint smell of pumpkin and rain in the air. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Children ran from house to house dressed as ghosts, witches, and superheroes, their laughter echoing in the dark. But that year, something evil hid behind the mask of Halloween. At around 9:00 p.m., the O'Brien family, Ronald, his wife Danine, and their two children, Timothy and Elizabeth, were finishing their trick or treat rounds. They joined another family, their friends the Bateses, to make the night more fun for the kids. It was just a typical Halloween. Flashlights flickering, candy bags rustling, parents talking at the edge of the sidewalk. No one could have guessed that one of the most horrifying crimes in American suburban history was about to unfold. As they walked down one dimly lit street, they approached a dark brick house with its lights turned off. The children hesitated. No lights usually meant no candy. But Ronald O'Brien told them to wait. He said he'd check if someone was home. He disappeared up the walkway into the shadows. A few moments later, he returned, smiling, holding a handful of large pixie sticks candies. He said the man inside the house had finally opened the door. The kids were thrilled. He handed out the sticks, long, colorful tubes of powdered sugar, one to each child. There were 5 in total. He gave one to his son Timothy, one to his daughter Elizabeth, 2 to the Bates children, and the 5th to a child he recognized from church who was still out trick or treating. It was a small, forgettable moment, but it would become the detail that defined the nightmare. Later that night, when they got home, the children dumped their candy onto the floor, sorting, trading, comparing. The living room smelled like sugar and excitement. 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien asked his dad if he could have 1 piece before bed. Ronald said yes, 1 piece. Timothy picked the pixie sticks. Ronald helped him tear it open. The powder seemed clumped together, maybe from humidity. Ronald gently massaged the tube to loosen it. Timothy poured the candy into his mouth. Seconds later, he complained it tasted bitter. Ronald gave him some cool aid to wash it down. Within moments, Timothy began vomiting violently. His body convulsed, and he screamed that his stomach hurt. Then he collapsed. Ronald called for help as his son went rigid, foam forming at his mouth. By the time they reached the hospital, Timothy was gone, dead within an hour. The town went silent. A child had died on Halloween night, after eating candy from trick or treating. Parents panicked, news spread like wildfire, rumors exploded. People whispered of poisoned candy, of madmen targeting children, of Halloween itself being cursed. Police arrived at the O'Brien home before dawn. They questioned everyone. They searched candy bags, tore open wrappers, and sealed each piece in evidence bags. Then they found it, the half-eaten pixie sticks Timothy had consumed. Inside was cyanide, enough to kill several adults. Detectives were stunned. The idea was almost unthinkable. Someone had gone house to house, giving poison to children. The mayor urged families to throw away all candy. Churches and schools set up drop-off stations for parents to surrender treats for testing. Fear spread faster than facts. But as investigators looked closer, the story didn't add up. If a random neighbor had poisoned candy, other children would have been dead too. But Timothy was the only victim, and something else stood out. The pixie sticks weren't sealed like factory candy. The tops were crudely stapled shut, as if someone had opened them and tried to reseal them. The police started tracing every detail. Every house the O'Briens had visited that night, every person who had handed out candy. But none of them had given out pixie sticks, except, supposedly, that dark house Ronald claimed to have visited alone. The one with the lights off. Detectives went to that house. It belonged to a man named Courtney Melvin, an air traffic controller. But there was a problem. Melvin wasn't home that night. He had an airtight alibi, Dozens of co-workers confirmed he'd been at work until late. So how did Ronald O'Brien get those pixie sticks? The police turned their focus on him. They began to notice strange details. Ronald seemed oddly calm during questioning. He talked about the poisoned candy like it was someone else's tragedy. Detached, clinical, rehearsed. And when they asked if he remembered which houses gave which candies, he hesitated. His answers kept changing. Then detectives learned about his financial troubles. He was deeply in debt, more than 100 Zalos and struggling to keep his job. He'd recently taken out life insurance policies on both his children. Bought 10 Zalos each, just weeks before Halloween. And only days before Timothy's death, he increased the coverage to 30,000 per child. When police checked with insurance agents, they discovered that on the morning after Timothy's death, Ronald called to ask how soon he could collect the payout. That's when the horror became clear. The killer wasn't a stranger hiding behind a dark door. It was the father, the man who had stood in the rain, smiling as he handed out poisoned candy to his own son and his friends. Ronald O'Brien had used the fear of Halloween, the myth of poisoned treats, as the perfect cover for murder. He planned to kill both his children for the insurance money. He gave poisoned pixie sticks to others too, to make it look random. But only Timothy ate his. Ronald O'Brien became known as the Candyman, and Halloween would never be the same again. The morning after Timothy's death, the small town of Deer Park was consumed by terror. Parents dumped out their children's candy into trash bags. Police cars rolled through the quiet streets, their sirens cutting the still Halloween air. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, shoving microphones into the faces of crying families. No one felt safe anymore, because if candy could kill, then innocence itself was gone. But investigators weren't looking for fear. They were looking for the truth, and the more they looked at Ronald O'Brien, the stranger everything became. When detectives questioned him again, his story changed. First, he said a man in a dark house gave him the pixie sticks. Then he said he couldn't remember the exact house. Then, he said he thought it might have been 2 houses earlier. But every house he mentioned checked out clean. Neighbors were cooperative. None had pixie sticks. None had opened their doors to him that night. It was as if the candy had appeared out of thin air. Meanwhile, forensic tests confirmed what everyone feared. Each pixie sticks Ronald had handed out contained potassium cyanide, enough to kill 3 adults per stick. The ends were carefully cut open, filled with the poison, and stapled shut. The signature was deliberate, not sloppy. Someone had planned it. Detectives dug deeper into Ronald's life. He was a 30-year-old optician, married with 2 kids, active in his church choir. To the outside world, he looked like the perfect suburban father. Gentle voice, pressed shirts, polite smile. But behind that mask, his life was falling apart. He was drowning in debt, behind on car payments, behind on the mortgage, and in trouble at work. He had been fired multiple times for negligence and theft. His credit was ruined. He was desperate. When officers spoke to his co-workers, they mentioned something odd. Ronald had been talking about money a lot. He'd even asked a co-worker, half-jokingly, if they knew how much life insurance policies for children cost. Then there were his recent actions. He'd taken out 3 separate life insurance policies on both Timothy and Elizabeth. One in January, another in September, and a final one just days before Halloween. He was paying for those policies on a credit card. The total payout if both children died, $60,000. More than enough to clear his debts. And just hours after his son's death, Ronald had already called the insurance company. He didn't ask about funeral arrangements. He asked when he could collect. Police started to quietly piece together their timeline. The poisoned pixie sticks had been given to 5 children. Timothy and Elizabeth O'Brien, 2 Bates children, and 1 boy Ronald recognized from church. Miraculously, none of the other children had eaten theirs. In fact, the 5th child had been found asleep in bed clutching the pixie sticks in his hand. His parents said he had tried to open it before falling asleep, but the staples at the top stopped him. If that staple hadn't been there, another child would have died. That detail, the staple, was the single thread that saved 4 lives and unraveled the entire lie. As the case built against Ronald, detectives executed a search warrant on his home. In his house, they found a pair of scissors with traces of powdered sugar and a small plastic bag filled with chemical residue. When tested, the residue contained potassium cyanide. The lab confirmed the match. It was the same substance that killed Timothy, and yet Ronald O'Brien maintained his innocence. He claimed he had been framed, that some stranger must have slipped him the poisoned candy without his knowledge. But no one was buying it. Detectives then tracked down local chemical suppliers. At one store, a witness remembered something strange. A man who fit Ronald's description had visited a few weeks before Halloween asking where he could buy cyanide. When told it was only sold in bulk quantities, he left angrily. He hadn't given a name, but the store clerk never forgot the conversation. The investigation was now airtight. When police confronted Ronald with the evidence, the insurance policies, the candy, the residue, the motive, he simply shook his head and denied everything. His expression, cold and rehearsed, never changed. When asked if he loved his son, he said, "Of course. But I didn't do this." He was arrested on November 5, 1974, 5 days after Halloween. The charge capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the country. The idea that a father could poison his own child, using Halloween candy as the weapon, felt almost unreal. It shattered something sacred about American family life. People didn't just mourn Timothy O'Brien, they mourned the death of safety, of trust, of the simple joy of Halloween night. From that point on, the fear of poisoned Halloween candy became an American legend, one rooted not in myth, but in truth. The trial that followed would expose not only Ronald's crime, but also his complete emotional emptiness. In the courtroom, he appeared calm, almost smug. When shown pictures of his dead son, he didn't flinch. Prosecutors described him as a man who used Halloween, a night of innocence, to disguise the most selfish murder imaginable. They called him the Candyman. Ronald's defense team tried to shift blame toward the mysterious man in the dark house, but witnesses, evidence, and logic destroyed that story piece by piece. Neighbors testified that Ronald never went up to that house. Others recalled that the house's lights were off all night. Even his own wife began to realize the truth. She testified that she had no knowledge of the life insurance policies Ronald had taken out. The jurors watched as she broke down crying on the stand. The image of a woman realizing her husband had murdered their son. The prosecution presented its final argument with chilling clarity. Ronald O'Brien was a man who looked at his children not as lives, but as numbers. He turned candy, a symbol of childhood, into a weapon, and he smiled while doing it. When the jury left to deliberate, no one expected a quick verdict, but they didn't even need an hour. They returned after 46 minutes, guilty on all counts. The judge didn't hesitate. He sentenced Ronald Clark O'Brien to death by lethal injection. When the sentence was read, Ronald didn't look up. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He just stared straight ahead, as if the weight of his own evil still hadn't sunk in. Ronald Clark O'Brien, the man who murdered Halloween, was sent to death row in Huntsville, Texas. He was placed in a small cell away from other inmates, his only company being the echo of his own breathing. He still claimed innocence, telling anyone who would listen that he was framed, that someone else had poisoned the candy. But no one believed him anymore. Not the court, not the jury, not even his wife. She divorced him soon after the trial. She took Elizabeth, their surviving daughter, and disappeared from the public eye. Ronald's family never visited him again. The years passed slowly inside the walls of Huntsville prison. Ronald tried to find meaning in religion, attending chapel, and writing letters to pastors and supporters, but his words were hollow. He never showed remorse. He never said, "I killed my son." Instead, he talked about being misunderstood, about being a victim of circumstance. Even behind bars, he clung to the illusion that he was still a good man, that he hadn't done anything wrong. But the world outside hadn't forgotten. In fact, his story became an urban legend, Parents everywhere warned their children not to eat unwrapped candy. Communities started scanning Halloween sweets. Hospitals began offering X-ray services for trick-or-treat bags. Every rustle of candy wrappers on Halloween night carried a whisper of fear. What if it's poisoned? And it all traced back to one man sitting on death row. In interviews, Ronald was calm, too calm. He told reporters he believed God would prove his innocence. He even said he forgave the people who wrongly accused him. But the evidence was undeniable. The scissors, the candy, the insurance, the motive. No one could twist that kind of truth. Still, he appealed his case for almost a decade. Appeal after appeal, delay after delay. Every time the court rejected him, he filed another. For 10 long years, Timothy's memory remained trapped in paperwork and hearings, while his killer sat alive, eating, breathing, waiting. By 1984, the execution date was finally set, October 31st, Halloween night. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who used Halloween to kill his own son was now scheduled to die on Halloween itself, but the date was later moved to March 31st, 1984, almost 10 years after the murder. On the day of his execution, crowds gathered outside the prison. Some held signs saying "Justice for Timothy." Others held bags of candy, chanting "Trick or treat!" It was a grim, carnival-like atmosphere, a mix of horror and celebration. Inside, Ronald ate his final meal, a T-bone steak, fries, peas, and ice cream. He barely touched it. When asked if he had any final words, he delivered a long, practiced speech. He talked about God, about forgiveness, about not being guilty. Even in his last breath, he refused to admit the truth. The chamber fell silent as the lethal injection began to flow. He closed his eyes, and within minutes, Ronald Clark O'Brien, the Candyman, was dead. Outside the prison, the crowd erupted. Some clapped, some cheered. But others stood quietly, their faces pale in the dim streetlights. Because even though justice was served, something about it all felt darker than before. Halloween would never be the same again. Reporters covered his death across the country. TV anchors described him as the man who poisoned the spirit of Halloween. And they were right. What he did didn't just kill a child, it killed trust. It changed how parents saw the world. Before 1974, Halloween was a night of freedom. Kids running through the streets, laughter echoing between houses, candy overflowing from plastic pumpkins. After 1974, it became a night of suspicion. A night when every parent checked every wrapper, sniffed every sweet, watched every bite. Ronald had made an entire generation afraid of what was once harmless. Psychologists studied his case for years. They tried to understand how an ordinary man could become a monster. There was no history of mental illness, no violent past, no warning signs. He wasn't insane. He was something worse. Rational and utterly self-serving. He turned murder into math. He saw love as liability. And he used candy, the purest symbol of childhood, as his weapon. Even decades later, his story still sends shivers down the spine. Because what makes it terrifying isn't the gore or the mystery. It's the banality of it. The fact that evil looked like a smiling father in a church choir. That the monster lived in a quiet suburb, under a porch light, holding his child's hand. And that's the truth about real horror. It doesn't come from the dark. It comes from people who pretend to live in the light. After his death, Timothy O'Brien's name was etched into history as the boy whose innocence changed Halloween forever. He was buried in Houston, Texas, his grave often visited by strangers who leave candy beside his headstone, unopened, untouched, a silent tribute to the boy who just wanted a sweet treat. Even today, 50 years later, when children knock on doors and say, "Trick or treat," when parents glance at the candy and feel that faint twinge of unease, the ghost of the Candyman lingers. He isn't in the shadows. He isn't in the candy. He's in the doubt, the whisper in your head that asks, "Can I really trust what's sweet?"